She bled for a pack that didn't even bother to carve her name into the winter stones. When the elders ordered the archives burned, they didn't just erase her mother's lineage, they erased her right to exist. For 10 years she scrubbed the blood off the local Alpha's floors, a nameless shadow in a brutal, freezing keep, until the Alpha King rode through the iron gates, dragged her from the mud, and knelt. The lie burned the cracks in Rowan's knuckles, biting into the skin like tiny, white-hot teeth. She didn't flinch. Flinching earned you a beating in the Frost Peak Keep, and her ribs were already bruised a deep, mottled plum from where Beta Holden had kicked her 2 days ago. She scrubbed the flagstones. Back and forth. The bristle brush was worn down to the wood, scraping against the rough-hewn stone of the great hall. It was freezing, the kind of medieval winter cold that seeped through the soles of your boots and nested in your marrow. Rowan didn't have boots. She had rags bound around her feet with frayed twine soaked through with the grey slush tracked in by the pack warriors. Hardaker. The voice belonged to Miller, the head steward, a fat, balding wolf who compensated for his weak standing in the pack by terrorizing the Omegas. Rowan didn't look up. She just leaned her weight into her shoulders and drove the brush harder against a stubborn stain of dried blood. One of the hunters had brought in a stag yesterday, dragging it straight through the hall. She had no name here. Not officially. 10 years ago, there was a fire in the pack archives. The official story was a stray ember from the hearth. The truth known only to the silent stones and the terrified Omegas was that Alpha Cedric had ordered it burned. Every scroll, every tapestry, every bloodline record tying the old rulers of Frostpeak to the current age gone. Rowan had been 8. She remembered the smell of burning parchment. She remembered her mother coughing on the smoke before Cedric's guards dragged her away. Her mother never came back. And Rowan ceased to be a person. She became a scrub, a stray, a punching bag for a pack that wanted to forget where they came from. A heavy wooden door slammed open at the far end of the hall, letting in a howling gust of wind and a flurry of snow. Alpha Cedric stormed in. He was a massive man, thick with muscle, and wrapped in heavily pelted cloaks. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. "Clear the hall!" Cedric bellowed. "Get the fires stoked! Bring out the winter reserves! The king is 2 leagues out!" The word sent a ripple of pure panic through the room. Servants dropped their brooms. Warriors scrambled to their feet. The Alpha King. He didn't just visit border packs. King Cassian was a warlord who spent his decades unifying the warring territories through blood iron and an unrelenting brutal will. He didn't care about the petty squabbles of lords. If he was coming to Frost Peak, he was coming for taxes for soldiers or for an execution. You. Cedric's boot suddenly planted itself heavily on Rowan's shoulder, shoving her backward. She hit the wet stone hard, biting her tongue to keep silent. The taste of copper flooded her mouth. "Get this filth out of sight. Lock her in the root cellar. I swear to the goddess, if the king smells the rot on her, I'll take your head, Miller." Miller scrambled forward, grabbing Rowan by the collar of her coarse tunic. "Up! Get up!" Rowan didn't fight. She let herself be hauled to her feet. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, her expression carefully blank. Inside her, Wolf was curled into a tight, miserable ball, too starved and beaten to even whimper. She was shoved down the narrow, twisting stone stairs that led to the underbelly of the keep. The air grew damp, smelling of earth and rotting potatoes. Miller shoved her into the small, lightless room and pulled the heavy iron-banded door shut. The lock clicked. Rowan stood in the pitch black. She wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of her hand, feeling the sting of the lie against her split lip. Above her, the ceiling trembled as the keep prepared for royalty. Heavy footsteps, shouting. The dragging of oak tables. She sank to the dirt floor, pulling her knees to her chest to conserve heat. It didn't matter. Kings and alphas, they were all the same. Men who wore crowns and men who wore fangs, both just looking for throats to rip out. She closed her eyes and waited for the cold to put her to sleep. The cellar door banged open, letting in a harsh slice of torchlight. Rowan blinked, raising a hand to shield her eyes. Her joints ached stiff from hours on the freezing dirt. It was night now. She could tell by the heavy, drunken rhythm of the footsteps above. The feast had started. "Get up, useless!" A kitchen maid snapped, tossing a clean, albeit threadbare, servant's apron at Rowan's face. "They drank through the main barrels. Miller says you're to haul the black ale casks up to the hall." The Alpha said, "I know what the Alpha said." The maid hissed her eyes wide with terror. "But if the King's Guard runs out of ale, Cedric will have our hides anyway. Keep your head down, pour the drinks, and don't make a sound." Rowan stood slowly. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she tied the apron around her waist. She walked past the maid heading for the heavy oak casks stacked in the corridor. Each one weighed nearly as much as she did. She hoisted one onto her shoulder, staggering for a second under the sheer crushing weight before finding her balance. She climbed the stone stairs. The noise grew deafening. When she pushed through the servants' entrance, the heat of the great hall hit her like a physical blow. The room was packed, hundreds of bodies sweating and drinking. The massive hearths roared with 6-foot flames. The smell was overpowering: roasted boar, sour sweat, spilled mead, and the heavy metallic tang of the royal guard. Rowan kept to the shadows along the wall. She moved mechanically, dropping the cask at the serving station, tapping it, and filling the heavy iron tankards. She chanced one glance at the high table. Alpha Cedric was sweating. He sat stiffly in his carved wooden chair, offering forced laughter at whatever was being said. Beside him sat King Cassian. He wasn't what the stories claimed. There was no divine aura, no golden crown resting perfectly on his brow. Cassian looked exhausted. He wore boiled leather and dark iron, practical and scuffed. His dark hair was tied back roughly, and a thick, jagged scar ran from his temple down to his jawline. He was leaning on one elbow, staring into his cup, with a look of absolute lethal boredom. The air around him was distorted, heavy with an alpha command, so thick it made Rowan's lungs ache from 50 feet away. "Girl!" A rough voice barked. Rowan snapped her attention down. One of the King's Guards, a massive man with a broken nose, was holding out an empty flagon. She hurried over pitcher of black ale in hand. Her hands were shaking slightly. The lye burns were cracking again from the heat of the room. She poured the ale. But as she did, a drunken Frost Peak warrior stumbled backward, slamming heavily into Rowan's shoulder. The pitcher slipped. A splash of dark ale hit the guard's iron breastplate, dripping down onto his leather breeches. The immediate area went dead silent. The guard looked down at his ruined clothes and then slowly up at Rowan. His eyes flashed gold. The wolf rising. Rowan started, her voice raspy from disuse. "Forgive me." Before she could step back, the guard's hand shot out, grabbing her by the throat. He didn't squeeze hard enough to kill, but the force lifted her toes off the floor. "Clumsy bitch!" he growled. The commotion caught the attention of the high table. Cedric stood up so fast his chair scraped violently against the stone. "Release her, Commander!" Cedric yelled, though there was a tremor in his voice. "She is a half-wit, an Omega scrub. I will have her punished." Rowan hung in the guard's grip, struggling to breathe. She didn't thrash. Fighting made it worse. She just stared blankly at the stone pillar behind the guard, waiting for the blow. "Put her down, Thorn." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't boom over the hall. It was low gravelly and laced with absolute authority. The guard instantly let go. Rowan hit the ground, gasping for air, clutching her bruised throat. She stayed on her hands and knees, staring at the floor. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy boots on the stone. The entire hall fell into a suffocating silence. Even the roaring fires seemed to quiet. King Cassian was walking down from the dais. Cedric scurried around the table, rushing to intercept him. "My king, I apologize. The servants in this keep are barely trained. I will have her thrown into the cold—" "Shut up!" Cassian didn't even look at Cedric. He stopped a few feet in front of Rowan. Rowan saw the scuffed toes of his dark leather boots. She smelled him now, not just the crushing dominance, but something under it. Pine needles, cold iron, rain on stone. It made the broken, starved wolf inside her stir, lifting its head from the darkness. "Look at me," Cassian commanded. Rowan squeezed her eyes shut. If she looked at him, Cedric would blind her later. "I said look at me." The command wasn't a request. It was an alpha pulse that slammed into her spine, forcing her muscles to obey. Rowan slowly lifted her head. She met the king's eyes. They were a startling, piercing amber. He stared down at her bruised face, her split lip, the dirt smeared on her cheeks. He didn't look disgusted. He looked confused. Then his nostrils flared. Cassian stepped closer. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the crackle of burning logs and Rowan's own ragged breathing. The king crouched down, his leather armor creaking. He was now eye level with her. Rowan instinctively flinched, pulling her shoulders up to protect her neck, waiting for the strike. Cassian's eyes flickered to the movement. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement so she could see it coming. He didn't grab her throat. He grasped her wrist. His hand was warm, calloused. He turned her hand over, looking at the raw, red burns from the lie, the split knuckles, the filth. Then he leaned in and took a breath. He froze. Cassian's amber eyes widened a fraction of an inch. His gaze snapped back to her face, searching her features with a frantic, sudden intensity. He looked at the shape of her jaw, the curve of her brow, the dull, lifeless grey of her eyes. "What is your name?" Cassian asked. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the quiet hall it carried. Rowan swallowed the lump in her bruised throat. "I don't have one, sire." "Everyone has a name." "They call me Girl, or Scrub." Cassian stood up slowly. He didn't let go of her wrist. In fact, his grip tightened, not painfully, but like a man holding onto a lifeline over a cliff. He turned to look at Alpha Cedric. Cedric was pale. The sweat on his forehead was gleaming in the torchlight. "My king," Cedric stammered. "She is a stray, taken in out of pity. Her mind is gone. Please return to the table and let us clear this trash." "A stray." Cassian's voice was dangerously flat. "Yes, a nobody." Cassian yanked Rowan to her feet. She stumbled, crashing lightly against his chest. He didn't push her away. Instead, his other hand went to the collar of her coarse tunic. Rowan panicked. She clamped both hands over his wrist. "No, please!" She begged the fear, finally breaking through her numb facade. Cassian looked down at her. The lethal coldness in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "I will not hurt you," he murmured, meant only for her. "Trust me." He pulled the rough fabric of her collar down slightly, exposing the base of her neck on the right side. There, etched into the pale skin, was a birthmark. It was pale pink, shaped like a crescent moon cradling a jagged peak. The old crest of Frost Peak, the mark of the original bloodline, the one Cedric had slaughtered to take the seat of power. Someone in the crowd gasped. Beta Holden stepped forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of his sword. "King Cassian, I must insist." Cassian moved faster than the eye could track. He let go of Rowan, drew the heavy broadsword from his hip, and leveled the tip of it directly at Cedric's throat. The royal guard instantly drew their weapons. The metallic swing of steel echoed off the stone walls. The Frost Peak warriors froze, utterly outmatched. 10 years ago. Cassian spoke, his voice vibrating with a monstrous, barely contained fury. "I received word that the royal family of the North had perished in a tragic fire. Mother, father, and their young daughter. Burnt to ash in the archives." Cedric was trembling, staring cross-eyed at the blade pressed against his Adam's apple. "A tragedy, my king. A terrible tragedy. Yes, Cassian said, stepping closer, pushing the point of the sword just enough to draw a bead of blood. Imagine my surprise when I come to collect my northern taxes, and I find the dead princess of the blood scrubbing your floors in rags. Rowan stared at the back of Cassian's armor. Her mind was spinning, violently rejecting the words. Princess. It was a word that belonged in stories. She was Rowan. She was the dirt on the floor. It's a mistake, Cedric choked out. A trick. She is a bastard. A whore's child bearing a coincidental mark. Cassian let out a dark, humorless laugh. He didn't sheathe his sword. He turned his head slightly, looking back at Rowan. Wolves can fake a mark, Cedric. They can fake documents. They can even fake a bloodline if they try hard enough. The king turned fully back to the Alpha. But they cannot fake the scent of a true northern sovereign. Her blood smells like winter and old iron. Yours just smells like a usurper's fear. Cassian lowered his sword, but the danger in the room did not decrease. He stepped back, reaching out a hand to Rowan. She stared at it. It was thick with calluses from a lifetime of war. It was offering her something she hadn't had in a decade. A choice. Rowan looked at Cedric. For 10 years that man had been a god in her eyes, a cruel, invincible god who decided if she ate, if she froze, if she bled. Right now he just looked like a pathetic, terrified man. Slowly, her hand trembling, Rowan reached out and placed her palm in the king's. Cassian's fingers wrapped around hers, warm and solid. He pulled her slightly behind him, shielding her from the room. Lock down the keep. Cassian ordered his men, his voice ringing with the finality of an executioner's axe. No one leaves. Tomorrow we hold a tribunal for treason, and tonight the princess eats at the high table. The water was too hot. Rowan sat in the center of the copper tub, her knees pulled tight to her chest, watching the steam rise toward the vaulted ceiling of the guest chamber. She hadn't felt hot water in 10 years. Her body didn't know how to process it. The heat felt like a threat, biting into her half-frozen skin, stinging the cuts on her legs and the lye burns on her hands. She flinched as a washcloth brushed her shoulder. Easy, a rough female voice muttered. The woman's name was Brida. She was a captain in the King's Guard, built like a brick wall, with a jawline covered in faded silver scars. She wasn't gentle. She didn't coo or offer pitying looks. She scrubbed the 10 years of grime off Rowan with the clinical efficiency of a soldier cleaning a rusted broadsword. Rowan appreciated that. Pity usually came right before a backhand. Lift your arms, Brida instructed. Rowan obeyed blindly. The water in the tub was turning a murky, brownish grey. The physical evidence of her existence as a scrub was melting away, swirling down the drain. But the deeper marks remained. As the dirt vanished, the landscape of her survival was laid bare. Brida paused. The rough washcloth hovered over Rowan's ribs. There were burn scars from the kitchens, pale, jagged lines from the times she hadn't dodged a hunter's whip fast enough. A dark, ugly bruise spreading across her left hip from Beta Holden's boot, and beneath it all the jutting architecture of starvation. Her ribs pushed against her pale skin like the bars of a cage. Who gave you the bruise on the hip? Brida asked. Her tone was flat, casual. Rowan stared at the water. Does it matter? The king asked me to take an inventory of your condition. Brida dropped the cloth into the water and reached for a bar of actual soap. It smelled heavily of pine and fat, devoid of perfume. He likes to know exactly who owes him a debt. Holden! Rowan rasped. Her throat still ached from where the guard had choked her in the hall. The Beta. I dropped a bundle of kindling in his path. Brida grunted. It wasn't a sound of sympathy. It was a soldier logging a target. Rinse. When Rowan finally stepped out of the tub, the cold air of the room hit her violently. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Breda tossed her a heavy, woven linen towel. It wasn't soft, but it was thick, and it trapped the heat against her skin. There was no silk dress waiting for her, no delicate slippers or corsets. The king's camp travelled for war, not pageantry. Breda handed her a pair of dark woolen trousers, a thick linen undershirt, and a heavy charcoal grey tunic meant for a man of smaller stature. It swallowed Rowan whole, the hem falling past her mid-thigh. "Put these on," Breda said, tossing a pair of thick woolen socks and worn leather boots at Rowan's feet. "We laced them tight. They'll have to do until the cobbler in the capital can fit you." Rowan stared at the boots. She traced the worn leather with her eyes. To have boots was to have a future, to survive the winter. For a decade she had walked on frost-bitten toes, wrapping her feet in whatever burlap she could steal. She pulled them on. They were heavy, grounding. "Why is he doing this?" Rowan asked, her voice cracking. She didn't look up from the laces. "Kings don't save scrubs, even if I have a mark on my neck. I'm broken. I have no pack. I have nothing to offer him." Breda stepped into her line of sight, her hand resting lazily on the pommel of her dagger. "You think King Cassian operates on charity?" "No, that's why I'm asking. You are the bloodline of the North, Princess." Breda said the title tasting strange and heavy in the small room. "Cedric holds this territory through fear. The outer villages hate him. The supply lines are failing. Frostpeak is a strategic nightmare for the crown right now because Cedric is a butcher, not a ruler. You aren't just a girl he pulled out of the dirt. You are the key to locking down the entire northern border." Rowan tied the laces tight. It made sense. It was cynical cold and entirely logical. She wasn't a fairy tale being rescued. She was a political asset. Oddly enough, that made her feel safe. Assets were protected. Assets were fed. Love and pity could vanish in a heartbeat, but a king's need for military stability, that was ironclad. Rowan stood up. The boots clunked solidly against the stone floor. She looked at Breda, her dull grey eyes hardening just a fraction. "Take me to the king." The great hall looked different from behind a wall of royal guards. 2 hours ago Rowan had been invisible, a ghost hauling ale. Now as she walked through the heavy oak doors, flanked by Breda and 3 armoured soldiers, the silence in the room was absolute. The hearths were still roaring, casting long, dancing shadows across the ancient tapestries. But the feasting tables had been shoved against the walls. The centre of the room was clear. King Cassian sat in the high chair. He had not changed his clothes. He still wore the scuffed leather and dark iron, looking less like a monarch holding court, and more like a predator waiting by a watering hole. Kneeling on the cold stone floor in the centre of the room were Alpha Cedric and Beta Holden. Their hands were bound behind their backs with heavy iron chains. The royal guard surrounded them, pole arms resting casually against the floor. The remaining members of the Frostpeak pack, the warriors, the servants, the elders who had turned a blind eye for a decade, were huddled along the walls. They looked terrified. Rowan walked down the centre aisle. Every step felt heavy. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, bruising rhythm. She kept her chin level. She did not look at the people she had scrubbed floors for. She did not look at the kitchen maid who had thrown the apron at her. She only looked at Cassian. The king watched her approach. His amber eyes tracked her movements, noting the oversized tunic, the heavy boots, the way she held her shoulders stiffly to hide the pain in her ribs. When she reached the base of the dais, she stopped. "Come up here," Cassian said. Rowan hesitated, then climbed the 3 stone steps. There was a smaller carved wooden chair placed to the right of the king. Cassian gestured to it. She sat down. The wood was hard. The seat of power was not comfortable. "Let us resume," Cassian said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs. He looked down at Cedric. "You claim the fire was an accident, a fallen candle in the archives." "It was my king," Cedric said. His voice was hoarse. He was sweating profusely, the grease shining on his forehead. The dry parchment caught quickly. AlphaTaurian and his mate were trapped inside. We tried to save them. The smoke was too thick. Cassian didn't react. He just slowly turned his head to look at Rowan. "Is that how you remember it?" Cassian asked her. Rowan looked down at Cedric. For 10 years this man's voice had meant starvation. His footsteps had meant pain. Seeing him on his knees, chained like a rabid dog, felt surreal. Her mind tried to pull her back into the dark cellar, tried to force her eyes to the floor. "Don't speak. Scrubs, don't speak." She curled her hands into fists, feeling the rough fabric of her trousers. She anchored herself in the present, in the heavy boots on her feet. "No," Rowan said. Her voice was quiet, but in the dead silence of the hall it carried perfectly. Cedric's head snapped up. "She is a lunatic. Her mind is broken from the lie and the cold. You cannot take the word of a—" Silence. Cassian didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The Alpha command rolled off him in a suffocating wave. Several pack members along the walls gagged, dropping to their knees from the sheer atmospheric pressure of it. Cedric choked, snapping his jaw shut, his eyes bulging. Cassian looked back at Rowan. "Tell me what happened." Rowan swallowed hard. The memory was buried deep, locked away under years of survival. She forced the door open. "My father didn't go to the archives to read." Rowan said the words coming out flat and detached. "He went because Holden told him the ledger was missing. My mother followed him. I was supposed to be in bed, but I wanted to see the hunting hounds, so I snuck down to the lower courtyard." She looked at Holden. The beta's face had drained of all color. He looked like a corpse. "I saw them." Rowan continued. "I saw Holden lock the heavy iron grate from the outside. I saw Cedric pour lamp oil beneath the heavy oak door. I watched him throw the torch. They didn't scream right away. They pounded on the wood." A collective gasp rippled through the pack members against the wall. A few of the older wolves ones who had served her father looked away in deep shame. "You lie!" Holden shrieked, losing his nerve entirely. He thrashed against his chains. "She lies, we weren't there. We were in the armory." Rowan looked at Holden, her grey eyes dead and cold. "You burned your left hand when the oil splashed back. You wore a bandage wrapped in salve for 3 weeks. Holden froze. Instinctively his chained hands twitched. Everyone in the room knew about the thick, knotted scar tissue covering the back of the beta's left hand. Cassian sat back in his chair. The truth was laid bare, ugly, and undeniable. The warlord did not look shocked. He looked profoundly tired of the predictable treachery of men. "You slaughtered a royal line," Cassian said to Cedric, his tone conversational, which was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. "You stole a territory that belongs to the crown, and you kept the sole surviving heir as a slave in her own home, hoping she would die of the winter cold so you wouldn't have to bloody your hands with a child's murder." Cedric bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. "Mercy," he whispered. "I rebuilt this pack. I kept the borders secure from the rogues. I offer you my absolute loyalty." "I don't need the loyalty of a rat," Cassian said. The king stood up. The movement was fluid, lethal. He drew the heavy broadsword from his hip. Holden screamed. Cedric squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the execution. "Wait." The single word cut through the air. It wasn't Cassian. It was Rowan. She stood up from her chair. Her legs were shaking, trembling so hard she thought she might collapse, but she locked her knees. She walked down the 3 steps, standing mere feet away from the men who had destroyed her life. Cassian paused, lowering the tip of his sword slightly. He looked at her, his amber eyes unreadable. "You object, Princess?" "No." Rowan said, her voice dropping into a raspy, jagged register. She looked at Cedric. "But a quick death by a king's blade is an honor, a warrior's death." She turned to face Cassian. The height difference was massive. He towered over her, a mountain of iron and muscle. But Rowan didn't shrink back. The starved wolf inside her was finally awake, and it was snarling. He took my name. Rowan said, her eyes locking onto Cassian's. He took my clothes, my warmth, my family, and my pack. He erased me. She pointed a scarred, lie-burned finger at Cedric. Don't give him an honorable death. Strip him. Burn his family crest. Strike his name from the ledger. Lock him in the root cellar without boots or fire and let the winter take him. The cruelty of the sentence hung in the air, heavy and brutal. It was not the plea of a merciful princess. It was the judgment of a survivor who knew exactly what the cold felt like. Cassian stared at her. For a long, suspended moment, the hall held its breath. The warlord's hardened face shifted. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in a dark, approving smirk. As the Princess of Frostpeak commands, Cassian said. He sheathed his sword with a heavy metallic clang. Guards, strip them. Brand over their pack marks. Throw them in the dark. The screams from the courtyard didn't bother Rowan. It was an hour later. The branding irons had been heated in the great hearths. Cedric and Holden were being stripped of their wolf marks, a pain that seared deeper than flesh, severing their connection to the pack spirit. Rowan sat on a stone bench in the high alcove overlooking the courtyard. The thick glass of the window muffled the noise, but she could still see the orange glow of the torches. She felt hollow. The revenge she had dreamt of for a decade was playing out below her, but it didn't bring her parents back. It didn't unbreak her ribs. It just left a strange, echoing silence in her mind. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. She didn't flinch this time. She recognized the steady, deliberate cadence of the king. Cassian stopped beside the bench looking out the window down at the courtyard. He held 2 heavy iron mugs. He offered one to her. Rowan took it. The ceramic was hot. It wasn't ale. It was mulled cider thick with cinnamon and honey. The sweetness coated her throat, soothing the ache. You have a dark heart, Rowan. Cassian said softly, not looking at her. You say that like it's a flaw. Cassian chuckled, a low, rumbling sound in his chest. In my line of work, it is a requirement. A soft heart gets your men killed. You gave them exactly what they earned. Rowan took another sip of the cider, wrapping both hands around the mug to leach the heat into her scarred palms. What happens now? Cassian leaned against the stone frame of the window. He looked exhausted again. The adrenaline of the tribunal fading, leaving the weariness of a man who carried a continent on his back. Frostpeak is a mess, Cassian said plainly. The pack is divided. The supply stores are half empty because Cedric was hoarding grain to sell to the southern merchants. If I leave you here on the throne, they will assassinate you within a week. You don't have the strength or the loyalists to hold the keep. Rowan looked down at her heavy boots. I know. You ride with me tomorrow at dawn, Cassian continued. Back to the capital, to the Iron Citadel. Rowan's grip tightened on the mug. As what a prisoner, a trophy, Cassian turned his head, his amber eyes catching the moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. He studied her face. The bruises, the sharp angles, the sheer exhaustion. As my ward, Cassian said. For now. Rowan scoffed quietly, a bitter sound. Don't pretend you're doing this out of the goodness of your heart, King Cassian. Breda already told me. You need the North. You need the bloodline to legitimize your control over the border packs. I'm just a walking, breathing deed to the land. Instead of getting angry, Cassian fully turned to face her. He crossed his arms over his armored chest. Breda talks too much. Cassian muttered, though there was no real heat in it. But she isn't entirely wrong. I am a King Rowan. Every move I make on the board has to serve the kingdom. Yes, bringing you back alive secures the North. It stops a civil war from breaking out across my borders. He took a step closer. his voice dropping, becoming rougher, more intimate. "But if I just needed a political pawn, I would have dragged you out of that cellar, slapped a crown on your head, and married you off to one of my generals." Rowan looked up at him, her brow furrowing. "Then why—" Cassian sighed, running a hand through his dark, messy hair. "Because when I looked into your eyes down in that hall, I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a broken scrub. I saw a wolf who had been starved, beaten, and buried alive for 10 years, and still had the strength to stand up and demand the blood of her enemies." He reached out his large, calloused fingers, gently brushing the side of her neck just inches from her birthmark. His touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to his lethal nature. "I don't want a pawn, Rowan. I want a queen who understands exactly what the dark looks like, because the court in the capital is a snake pit. The lords smile at you while they poison your cup. I need someone at my side who sees through the velvet and the gold, someone who knows how to survive." Rowan stopped breathing for a second. The word queen hung in the air between them, heavier than the iron in his armor. She looked at him. Really looked at him. Cassian wasn't offering her a fairy tale romance. He wasn't promising to kiss her scars and make the nightmares go away. He was offering her a partnership born of necessity. A tactical alliance. He saw her trauma not as a defect, but as a weapon. For the first time in a decade, Rowan didn't feel useless. She pulled back slightly, breaking the contact with his hand. She wasn't ready for softness. Not yet. "I don't know how to be a noble," Rowan said, her voice steady. "I know how to scrub lie. I know how to skin a rabbit. I know how to stay quiet." "I have enough nobles," Cassian replied, a grim smile touching his lips. "I can hire 100 tutors to teach you which fork to use at a banquet, but I cannot teach them the iron in your spine. That is forged." He finished his cider and set the empty mug on the windowsill. "Get some sleep, Princess. The ride south is long and the capital is much warmer, but it is infinitely more dangerous." Cassian turned and walked down the stone corridor, his heavy cloak billowing behind him. Rowan sat alone in the alcove. She looked out at the falling snow. She was leaving Frost Peak. The only hell she had ever known. She looked down at her hands, at the raw red skin and the broken nails. She wasn't a scrub anymore, and she wasn't a pawn. She took a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs without the sharp, stabbing panic of survival. For the first time, she allowed the dormant, starved wolf inside her to open its eyes, fully looking towards the south, toward the Iron Citadel, toward a crown. The Iron Citadel was a fortress masquerading as a palace. It sat at the southern edge of the continent, carved directly into the face of a jagged coastal cliff. As the king's retinue rode through the colossal steel gates, Rowan tasted salt in the air. The winter here was a mild, wet chill, nothing like the bone-snapping frost of the north. But as she looked at the towering spires of white marble and obsidian, she felt a different kind of cold. The courtyard was lined with courtiers. They were draped in heavy velvets, spun silks, and vibrant dyes that hurt Rowan's eyes. They bowed as King Cassian's black warhorse trotted past their faces, perfectly schooled into masks of absolute reverence. Rowan rode a steady grey mare 2 paces behind the king. She could feel their eyes on her. They didn't see a princess. They saw a threat. They saw the rough, ill-fitting wool of her travelling cloak. They saw the jagged, uneven cut of her hair, which Breda had hacked short with a hunting knife to remove the matted filth of the cellar. They saw the way Rowan slouched slightly in the saddle, protecting ribs that were still knitting back together, shoulders back. Breda murmured from her left, her horse stepping in perfect synchronization with Rowan's. "If you bleed in front of sharks, they bite." Rowan forced her spine straight. Her muscles screamed, but she locked her jaw. She didn't look down at the lords and ladies. She looked through them. When they dismounted, Cassian didn't wait for the pleasantries. He tossed his reins to a stable hand and walked straight toward the grand staircase. The crowd parted for him like water. He didn't look back to see if Rowan was following. He expected it. The interior of the citadel was a suffocating display of wealth. Woven rugs thick enough to swallow a boot. Chandeliers dripping with forged glass and rendered fat candles. But beneath the heavy scent of myrrh and roasted meats, Rowan's nose twitched. Fear, jealousy, ambition. The pheromones in the massive entry hall were a chaotic, toxic soup. A tall man stepped into Cassian's path. He wore a doublet of deep emerald, his silver hair slicked back. His smile was smooth, but his eyes were entirely dead. "My king," the man said, offering a shallow, calculated bow. "Your return blesses the citadel. We expected you a fortnight ago. The council has been anxious." "The North required my extended attention, Lord Harland." Cassian said, his voice flat. He didn't stop walking, forcing the older lord to pivot and scramble to keep pace. Harland's eyes flicked to Rowan. The disgust was microscopic, hidden behind a polite veneer, but Rowan caught it. She had survived 10 years by reading the micro-expressions of abusers. Harland thought she was trash. And this guest. Harland asked, his tone dripping with artificial curiosity. "The rumors from the Outriders claim you found a ghost in the snow." Cassian stopped abruptly. The sudden halt caused a ripple of panic among the following guards. He turned to face Harland. The king didn't yell. He simply let his aura drop a heavy, suffocating blanket of alpha dominance that made the air in the corridor turn to lead. Harland visibly choked, his polished smile fracturing. "She is no guest," Cassian stated, the gravel in his voice echoing off the marble. "She is Rowan of the Northern Bloodline, Princess of Frostpeak, and she will be given the respect of her station, Harland, or I will let her mount your head on a spike in the gardens. Do we understand each other?" Harland swallowed hard, his eyes wide. "Of course, sire. A misunderstanding." Cassian turned away, dismissing the man entirely. He looked at Rowan. "Brida will show you to your quarters. Rest. Tomorrow, the wolves of the court will come to test your teeth." The quarters they gave her were larger than the entire servants' wing at Frostpeak. A massive hearth roared with a steady fire. The bed was a monstrosity of carved oak and goose-down pillows. But when Brida finally left her alone, locking the heavy brass doors behind her, Rowan didn't go to the bed. She walked to the hearth, grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from the mattress, and curled up on the hard stone floor in front of the fire. She stared into the flames. Cassian had protected her in the hall, but she knew it was a demonstration of his own power, not just a defense of hers. He was using her to draw a line in the sand. "I control the North. I control the bloodline." Rowan closed her eyes, the heat of the fire sinking into her scarred hands. If she was going to survive this gilded cage, she couldn't rely on the king to bare his fangs for her every time a lord sneered. The court wanted to see a broken scrub. She decided right then she would show them a monster instead. 2 weeks passed. The Citadel was a masterclass in psychological warfare. No one kicked Rowan in the ribs here, no one locked her in a cellar. Instead, the violence was perfectly polite. It came in the form of maids who accidentally shrank her new wool tunics in the wash. It came from courtiers who switched to rapid regional dialects when she entered a room, laughing behind crystal goblets. Rowan absorbed it all. She didn't complain to Cassian. The king was buried in war councils trying to stabilize the trade routes Cedric had destroyed. They rarely spoke, passing only like ships in the dark corridors of the keep. But she felt his eyes on her during the evening meals, watching, evaluating. The real test came on the night of the winter solstice banquet. Brida had forced her into a dress. It was a dark, midnight blue velvet, heavily embroidered with silver thread at the cuffs and collar. It was high-necked, hiding the birthmark, and the worst of the fading bruises, but the cut was tailored to her newly recovering frame. She looked lethal. sharp angles and cold grey eyes. The great hall of the citadel was blindingly bright. Hundreds of nobles sat at long tables, feasting on glazed pheasant and imported fruits. Rowan sat at the high table 2 seats down from Cassian. Opposite her sat Lady Genevieve. She was the daughter of the wealthiest southern lord, a stunning wolf, with golden hair and a smile that looked like a bear trap. Genevieve had been vying for Cassian's bed and his crown for 3 years. Rowan's sudden appearance had derailed her ambitions, and the hostility radiating from the woman was practically radioactive. Princess Rowan. Genevieve called out, her voice carrying over the din of the hall. The music seemed to quiet slightly. Heads turned. The court smelled blood. Rowan slowly set down her silver fork. She met Genevieve's eyes. Lady Genevieve, I must say your recovery is miraculous. Genevieve purred, lifting a goblet of crimson wine. To endure such squalor for a decade. It must be so overwhelming to sit at a table with proper cutlery. If you need instruction on which spoon to use for the marrow, you need only ask. A few quiet, mocking chuckles rippled down the table. Cassian stopped eating. He didn't intervene. He leaned back in his heavy chair, his amber eyes fixed on Rowan. He was waiting. Rowan looked at the array of silver tools beside her plate. She looked at the delicate crystal glass in Genevieve's hand. Then she looked back at the golden-haired lady. I know how to extract marrow, Genevieve, Rowan said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a strange, hollow deadliness that cut through the background noise. You crack the bone against the stone floor, you use a splinter of wood to dig out the fat, and if a rival wolf tries to take it from you, you put the splinter through their eye. The laughter at the table died instantly. Genevieve's smile froze on her face. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her goblet. A savage jest. How quaint. It wasn't a jest. Rowan set her face completely expressionless. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the heavy oak table. You all look at me and see a victim. You think because I scrubbed floors I am weak, but you forget what survival actually requires. She picked up a heavy, serrated steak knife from the table. She didn't point it at Genevieve. She simply turned it over in her hands, staring at the polished steel. You play games with words and spilled wine. Rowan continued, her voice dropping into a low, terrifying calm. You poison reputations. I have watched wolves tear out each other's throats for half a rotten potato. I know what real monsters look like, Genevieve. And they don't wear velvet. She drove the knife down. The blade buried itself an inch deep into the solid oak table right between her own plate and Genevieve's. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot. Several lords jumped back. Genevieve gasped, pressing a hand to her chest, her eyes wide with genuine shock. Rowan didn't blink. She stared into Genevieve's soul, letting a fraction of her own dormant alpha blood push outward. It wasn't the suffocating ocean of Cassian's power, but it was sharp, cold, and feral. It smelled like blood on the snow. Keep your etiquette, Rowan whispered, and keep out of my way. The silence in the hall was absolute. No one breathed. Then a low, deep sound broke the tension. Cassian was laughing. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a rich, dark laugh that shook his chest. The king reached for his goblet, raising it in the air. He looked at Rowan, his amber eyes burning with something dangerously close to pride. To the north. Cassian roared, his voice filling the cavernous hall. The terrified courtiers scrambled to lift their glasses, their hands shaking. To the north. They echoed weakly. Rowan let go of the knife. She didn't smile. She just picked up her own goblet, took a sip of the water, and resumed eating. Under the table, out of sight of the court, a large, warm hand found her knee. Cassian's fingers squeezed briefly, a silent physical anchor. An acknowledgement. She had passed the test. The sharks wouldn't bite anymore. They were too afraid of her teeth. The lower archives of the Iron Citadel smelled of dry rot, binding glue, and old dust. It was a suffocating scent to most wolves who preferred the crisp air of the pine forests or the salt of the sea. To Rowan, it smelled like leverage. For a week she had barely slept. While the southern lords drank imported wine and whispered behind their velvet sleeves, Rowan sat in the freezing subterranean vault of the castle, surrounded by towering columns of tax ledgers. She was tracking the grain. Cedric hadn't just stolen her throne. He had systematically hollowed out the north, selling off the winter reserves to black market merchants in the south to line his own pockets. She was building a paper trail, piece by piece, matching the dates of the starved winters she had survived to the inflated bank drafts of men like Lord Harland. If she was going to wear a crown, she refused to be a blind ornament sitting next to a king. She was going to hold the leash. The heavy oak doors of the archive were closed. Breda was stationed outside an immovable wall of muscle and iron. The citadel was supposed to be the safest place on the continent. It happened in absolute silence. There was no shout, no clash of steel, just a sickening muffled thwack, the sound of heavy metal striking a skull through a leather helmet, followed by the dull thud of Breda's massive body hitting the stone floor. Rowan's hand froze over the ledger. Her blood turned to ice water. 10 years of scrubbing floors in a keep full of vile and unpredictable warriors had rewired her nervous system. A court-bred noble would have gasped. They would have called out for the guard. Rowan didn't even breathe. She silently reached down to her heavy leather boot and pulled the dark iron letter opener she had slipped inside that morning. It wasn't a sword, but it was sharp. The iron hinges of the doors groaned. Rowan slipped backward, fading into the pitch-black space between two towering shelves of legal texts. She crouched low, ignoring the sharp protest of her healing ribs, and steadied her breathing. 3 figures stepped into the dim light of the reading lamps. They wore boiled leather dyed matte black. No insignias, no pack marks. Mercenaries. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized fluidness of professionals. In their hands they held short, curved daggers. The blades possessed an ugly, oily sheen that caught the lamplight. Wolfsbane paste. A single scratch would paralyze a shifter's nervous system in seconds, turning them into a statue while they suffocated. Split up. The largest of the 3 whispered, his accent thick and southern. Find the northern bitch. Make it quiet. The guard changes in 4 minutes. They fanned out. Rowan pressed her back against the damp stone wall of the aisle. Her heart hammered against her sternum, a frantic, bruising rhythm. She was unarmed against 3 trained killers. The air in the narrow aisle felt heavy, suffocating. Her mind briefly flashed back to the root cellar at Frost Peak, the dark, the cold, the absolute helplessness. The wolf inside her snarled, vicious and starved. No, she was done hiding in the dark. She listened, the soft scrape of leather soles against stone. One of the assassins was moving down her aisle, peering into the shadows. He was a broad-shouldered man holding his poisoned blade, loosely arrogant in his advantage. Rowan didn't wait to be found. As the man passed a gap in the shelves, Rowan launched herself from the shadows. She didn't aim for a cinematic strike. She kicked him precisely in the back of the knee, with the heavy, reinforced heel of her boot collapsing his joint inward with a wet crunch. The man dropped with a strangled grunt. Before he could raise his dagger, Rowan grabbed a massive brass-bound encyclopedia from the shelf above and swung it downward with everything she had. The corner of the book caught him square on the temple. He crumpled face first onto the stone, out cold. The noise was deafening in the quiet vault. Aisle 4. One of the others barked. Footsteps rushed her position. Rowan scrambled backward, tearing books from the shelves, hurling heavy, ancient tomes into the aisle to disrupt their footing. She vaulted over a long oak reading table, her dark velvet skirts tearing against the rough wood. The second assassin vaulted the table right behind her. He lunged his poisoned blade, slashing a hair's breadth from her cheek. Rowan twisted violently, ignoring the tearing pain in her side. She grabbed his knife wrist with both hands, using his own forward momentum to drag him off balance. As he stumbled, she brought her knee up, smashing it brutally into his ribs. He dropped the knife with a hiss of pain, but he was faster than she was. He spun, driving a heavy fist into her stomach. Rowan gagged the air, exploding from her lungs. She stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a bookshelf. Before she could recover, the third assassin grabbed her from behind. A thick, leather-clad forearm locked around her windpipe, crushing her throat. "Got you, you feral rat!" The man snarled directly into her ear. Panic flared, blinding and white-hot. Her airway was completely cut off. Black spots danced at the edge of her vision. Rowan dug her nails into the man's arm, but it was like clawing at iron. She was losing consciousness. But she refused to die like a victim. She slammed her head backward, crushing her skull into the bridge of his nose. Cartilage shattered. The man howled, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Rowan dropped her weight, slipping free of his hold. She grabbed a heavy wrought-iron candlestick from the table and spun around. Before she could strike, the heavy oak doors of the archive didn't just open, they exploded. Thick wood splintered outward as the doors were ripped from their iron hinges. Cassian stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his crown or his king's armor. He wore a simple linen undershirt and trousers, his bare feet planted on the stone. His chest was heaving, and his eyes weren't amber. They were a glowing liquid gold. The Alpha King's wolf was entirely at the surface. He didn't speak. He moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics. He crossed the room in a terrifying blur of sheer concentrated violence. He didn't bother drawing a weapon. He grabbed the recovering assassin by the throat, lifted him entirely off the floor, and slammed him against the stone wall with such catastrophic force that the masonry cracked behind him. The man's neck snapped with the sound of a dry branch breaking in winter. He dropped to the floor lifeless. The second assassin, clutching his bruised ribs, let out a sound of pure terror and scrambled towards the exit. Cassian pivoted, a low, monstrous rumble vibrating in his chest. His claws fully extended, ready to tear the man in half. "Cassian, stop!" Rowan yelled. Her voice was raspy, damaged from the chokehold, but it carried absolute authority. "We need him alive!" The king froze. His arm was pulled back for a lethal strike, his muscles coiled tight as steel springs. He looked at the trembling assassin cowering on the floor, then slowly turned his head to look at Rowan. The gold in his eyes flickered, fighting the rage before slowly receding back to the familiar, piercing amber. He exhaled a ragged, shaking breath. He stepped back. Guards poured into the room, their swords drawn, stepping over a groaning breeder, who was bleeding from a massive gash on her temple, but was very much alive, and swearing viciously. "Take him to the dungeons," Cassian ordered, his voice devoid of all emotion. "If he dies before I interrogate him, I will hang the lot of you." He ignored the chaos. He walked straight toward Rowan. Cassian didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't treat her like fragile porcelain. He looked at the dead man on the floor, the unconscious one bleeding onto the ledgers, and the ruined, torn state of her velvet dress. He looked at the iron letter opener gripped tightly in her scarred hand. "You fight dirty," Cassian murmured, his voice low. "I fight to live." Rowan replied, forcing her shaking hand to drop the blade. Cassian reached out. His large, calloused hands gently cupped her face, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. The lethal violence in his posture melted into something terrifyingly profound. It wasn't the transactional look of a warlord evaluating a political asset. It was the desperate, possessive relief of a mate. They thought they could use the dead of night to break you. Cassian said softly, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating off his chest, grounding her. "They don't understand that you are harder to kill than I am." Rowan looked up into his eyes. The fortress she had built around her heart over 10 agonizing years The walls of stone and ice finally cracked. She didn't pull away from the warmth. She leaned into his touch. "They won't try it again," Rowan whispered. "Because whoever paid them is going to bleed?" Cassian smiled. A true dark smile that reached his eyes, making him look less like a monster and more like a man who had finally found his equal. "Yes, they will," he agreed. He let his hand slide down his fingers, gently tracing the pale pink crescent moon on her neck. A king commands fear, but a queen forged in the winter commands survival. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was heavy with the metallic tang of adrenaline, the desperate relief of survival, and the promise of absolute ruin for their enemies. Rowan kissed him back, her scarred hands gripping the linen of his shirt, anchoring herself to the only man who had looked at the dirt on her skin and seen a sovereign. 2 days later, the Citadel's great hall was deadly silent. The surviving mercenary had talked. It hadn't taken long. Lord Harland knelt on the cold marble floor, his emerald doublet stripped of its silver pins, his polished smile completely gone. He was shaking. Beside him, Lady Genevieve stared at the floor, her golden hair a mess, weeping silently. Cassian sat in the high chair, his face carved from stone. He looked down at the traitors, then slowly turned his head toward the smaller, unadorned wooden chair beside him. "The crime is treason against the crown," Cassian announced to the trembling court. "But the target was the North. The sentence belongs to the Queen." Rowan stood up. She wore no velvet today. She wore dark, boiled leather and practical wool. She walked down the stone steps, her heavy boots echoing loudly in the quiet hall. She stopped directly in front of Harland. "Please," Harland choked out, refusing to meet her eyes. "Mercy, I beg you." Rowan looked at the man who had tried to have her slaughtered like a rabid dog in the dark. She thought of the lye burns on her hands. She thought of the root cellar. "Death by the executioner's block is too warm, Harland." Rowan said, her voice flat and utterly devoid of pity. "Strip them of their wealth. Burn their crests. Cast them out to the eastern steppes without mounts or coin. Let them see exactly how long their arrogance keeps them warm. The cruelty of the sentence was absolute. It was a death sentence, but a slow, agonizing one. No one in the court objected. No one dared. They finally understood exactly who sat on the throne. A month later, the first true snow began to fall over the Iron Citadel. Rowan stood on the high balcony overlooking the churning dark sea. She wore a heavy cloak lined with black fur. On her head rested a simple, unadorned circlet of forged iron. It was heavy cold and entirely devoid of jewels. It was exactly what she wanted. Cassian stepped out onto the balcony, the freezing wind whipping his dark hair. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her back against his chest, resting his chin comfortably on the top of her head. "The caravans from Frost Peak arrived this morning," Cassian said quietly into the frigid air. "The elders have bent the knee. The ledgers are balanced. The North is yours." Rowan leaned back into his embrace, watching the white snowflakes melt instantly into the dark, violent water below. She traced the rough iron of her crown with a scarred finger. She wasn't a nameless scrub anymore. She wasn't a ghost haunting the cellars. She was the Queen of the Wolves, and the winter was finally, utterly hers. If you loved watching Rowan rise from a nameless scrub to a ruthless, unstoppable queen, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Her journey proves that the wolves who survive the darkest winters always bite the hardest. Who was your favorite character in this story? Let me know down in the comments, and don't forget to share this video with your pack. Ring the bell so you never miss another epic werewolf romance drama. See you in the next one.